We are lucky enough to be talking to San Bernardino Police Chief Darren Goodman. Chief, thank you so much for agreeing to come in and speak with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So I know you are a highly formally educated law enforcement officer, chief, and arguably you have more on-the-job experience, expertise, and training. So when I thought about the topic of education and educational requirements in law enforcement, you were the first person I thought of. Can you just break down for us, just real quickly, your formal education background?
Yeah, well, I would first like to say I probably didn't take the traditional route to education. I obtained most of my formal education after being on the job. I was like most people out of high school. I wasn't really sure what path I was going to take. Had done some college, but when I came into the sheriff's department, I hadn't completed a degree. And it wasn't until later in my career that I was convinced that it was probably a good idea to have a backup plan. The one thing I will say right off the bat is, I didn't do it for promotion. And I get people who ask me all the time about attaining education for the purposes of promotion. And I always say, that's not a guarantee. Promotion is not a guarantee. But what is a guarantee is if you have your degree, if you have a chosen educational path, that's something that you have forever and something that you can use in this career or outside of it. So I got my bachelor's degree. I got my bachelor's degree from Southern Illinois University in education and training. Got my master's degree from USC.
Yep, fight on.
Go Trojans, fight on. Yeah, absolutely. In public administration. And then I went on to get my doctorate degree also from USC in organizational leadership. So having acquired a terminal degree has given me some insight that I don't want to do it again. It's like I enjoyed it, but I look back and I sometimes think, what was I thinking? Because at the same time I was completing both my master's and my doctorate. I was doing other programs. I'd also attended Naval Postgraduate School. I attended a program through Harvard, leadership program.
No, a slacker, I see.
Yeah, total slacker. So in some of these things overlapped. So it was daunting, to say the least. And then I still had that thing called work, that I had to do in between, and family. So it was a grind. It was a grind. So I would not encourage anyone to do it the way I did it, but there are some benefits.
I always tell my kids mostly, right? Anything worth doing isn't easy, right? So clearly you thought it was worth doing, even though promotion wasn't guaranteed or anything like that. But now here you are, chief of police. Right. So you oversee large budgets, a large organization, personnel. How do you think, this may be an obvious question, but in what tangible ways can you see that a formal education has helped you?
I'll be honest. The first thing it does is take the conversation off the table. And, a lot of times when you have a degree, then you don't have to discuss that. Your credibility is at least acknowledged. And I'll be the first to say that I don't think a degree makes anyone necessarily smarter than anyone else.
Agreed.
That's not, my belief at all. But in a business environment, especially in a competitive environment, qualifications are a part of the conversation.
Yeah.
And so if you have that qualification, and I hate to use the term, that box checked,
right,
then now that's off the table, and now you can get to the business at hand. And then now people will see you or listen to you for what information you have, what knowledge you have, and you're not being judged on what you don't have. So I think, going back to parental advice, what my mom particularly used to say is, having it isn't going to make the difference, but not having it will.
Ooh,
so I believe that. I believe that having a degree isn't going to be the say all end all to everything, but not having it means that you won't even get in the door, and there's certain conversations that you won't be in the room for because you don't have it.
It's interesting that yet you started this career without the formal education, and that's kind of what we're discussing today, because there's been a huge push a bill specifically from Reggie Jones Sawyer, but just more so just a
Good old Reggie
conversation.
Jones Sawyer. He's at it again, huh?
Well,
no, this is an old
yeah,
one.
this is an old bill, right?
Yeah,
but the deadline was supposed to be this summer.
Right.
And like most bills, it wasn't really passed on analysis or competency and being able to solve a problem, or if it was even a problem, it was just passed to, like you said, check a box for, a politician to say they've put their stamp on, law enforcement or whatever. Yeah. But yeah, so there is the requirement, but everybody's waiting because there's supposed to be a modern policing bill that everybody's supposed to have or get at some point to be able to do this job. But the irony is that the bill was actually passed a couple years ago and then put on this task force to create this curriculum of a modern policing bill, and it was due in June of last year, so we're almost coming up on a year. And I don't mean to say anything bad about the task force because they were given a monumental task, but I think especially because SEBA was involved in these conversations about whether it was necessary or not, I think it then begs the question, if the people who are mandating this can't even get it together enough to make it happen, what does that say about the true necessity of it? And really, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Yeah. What do you think? And we can get into all the complexities of it, but just in terms of,
it's very complex, and I think not to cut you off, but I think one of the issues that I see with the bill, as with so many that come out of Sacramento, is first and foremost they don't consult the experts. Now, full transparency, I know because I was involved with going up and advocating against this bill, particularly as we've advocated against several others. This bill started on a flawed premise, and that flawed premise was that this was another one of those bills that was designed or conceived rather after the George Floyd incident. And even in their language includes an attempt to professionalize policing and eliminate racism from policing and include equity in policing and all those buzzwords that are a part of this premise that law enforcement is inherently racist and inherently unprofessional. And so for me, I object to that premise, and I don't agree with that premise. And I think that when you're trying to solve a problem and you start with the wrong issue, then you're getting nowhere near solving the problem. And while we have a lot of things that we can do better, we have a lot of things that probably deserve attention and need to be fixed, I don't think viewing law enforcement as inherently, fundamentally racist is our problem. Yeah. That's simply not true. And, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole on the George Floyd incident, I think we've all heard enough, but the bottom line is, even if you look at that incident, they didn't choose George Floyd. Yeah. They didn't go pick a random black man. That was a call for service because he was passing a counterfeit $20 bill. He was under the influence of fentanyl. So it wasn't like, let's just go find a black guy. Yeah. So even the premise of their bill has some inherent flaws. Now, when you dig into what they're talking about, even some of the proposed curriculum, is problematic. I think that, we've done a good job in law enforcement and professionalization. We have done remarkable in terms of cultural awareness, cultural diversity, and actual diversity. I mean, you're sitting here talking to a black police chief. Right. These aren't issues that we've shied away from in law enforcement. We've addressed them, we've corrected them, we've improved them. But now you have Sacramento who's saying that we need to go backwards or do more, essentially, because of an incident that, again, is being viewed from an extreme lens. And, we weren't at the table, so to speak. I think they had a retired police chief there, a sergeant, and I think one sheriff. 3 out of 21 people on their task force have any law enforcement experience. And I would wonder, how much actual input they had. And I would venture to say it wasn't much.
Well, that's the way they like to design their committees, though, because that's the same thing they did for SB2 for the decertification. They like to design their community. They do it on purpose. They only put a few law enforcement and a lot of other voices, which, look, it's not, public safety is for the public, right? We go out there and you, not me anymore, but, this
But
profession, yes, I did used to. I'll have a little Al Bundy moment. No. But, we realize we're doing a public service. So, of course, the public has to have input. It has to have trust and all those things. But the fact that the expertise then, and going back to looking at someone with your degrees and your pedigree, your experience in the job, and, despite what we were saying about it gets you in the room and it gets people to hear you in Sacramento, none of that matters. All of that time on the job, all of that education, the fact that you're a black police chief, they're like, thanks, but yeah, we know better than you, that's a whole nother tangent, Sacramento.
Yeah. Well, and obviously, my perspective wouldn't fit their narrative, so of course they wouldn't invite me into the room. But I think, even outside of the flawed premise, I think there's a whole set of other issues that makes this problematic, and that gets into implementation, that gets into financing the program, and it gets to operational realities that I don't think they've considered. If you want to have a mandate that law enforcement officers have a degree before entering the field, you have to have an understanding of what it takes to even get an officer from the application process into a patrol car.
Right.
And that process alone, without a degree, can be anywhere from 16 to 18 months. And I think if you start imposing a mandated degree requirement, we would suffer tremendously from a lack of applicants. We're already competing very heavily for the same applicants.
Yes.
And that would only be exacerbated by this mandate.
So the irony is, in its first iteration, the first year that Reggie Jones Sawyer tried to pass this, it didn't go through, right? He got it done on his second time, and now it's finally being implemented. Well, it's not being implemented because it was never finished. And who knows if it's ever going to be finished, quite frankly, because the political tides have shifted and they're not so concerned about us anymore, at the moment. But it was still during post-COVID. And so we were invited, SEBA was invited for a Zoom meeting with Reggie Jones Sawyer and his analysts and the people that were writing the bill to get our input. Talk about a check the box moment. It was myself, who does have a college degree, bachelor's, USC, and a master's. And then my colleague, Phil Jonas, who at the time was the SEBA secretary, and now he actually works here, which is great, who does not have a college degree, but is a wealth of information, has, decades of experience. And so we kind of went as a team to show that just like any other group of people, law enforcement is not a monolith. You need everybody. You need diversity, not just in skin color. You need diversity in thought. You need diversity in educational levels, military experience, backgrounds, right? You can't just have one type of person or think that a college educated, I don't want to say kid because they're adults, is going to do the job better. It's myopic, in my opinion.
I agree wholeheartedly. I don't think that that's the solution, nor has it ever proven itself to be. When you look at the dynamics of law enforcement, absolutely, you want someone to have critical thinking skills. You want someone to have the ability to reason. But those particular skill sets can be acquired in other ways through other areas of life and life experience. I would rather have a person who's actually gone through some things in the military, person who's experienced some trials and tribulation through marriage or family and living life than someone who's just sat in the classroom. So there's a balance, and I'm not throwing one out in favor of the other. But what I am saying is that, by proposing a mandate that makes it almost one dimensional, where you have to have this degree or you're not qualified to be a police officer, is problematic.
I remember having this debate with a close friend of mine. We went to USC together, and post 2020, there were lots of conversations with my friends outside of law enforcement, which I'm grateful for, right? Because we can have discussions and we can share thoughts and agree to disagree.
Right.
But college educated just was adamant about the fact that, that should be a requirement. And this is a person in medical sales device, so I asked him, would you be a law enforcement officer with your degree from USC and your 2 masters after that? He goes, well, no. I said, okay, so I don't think you're even qualified to really give an opinion. I mean, you can have an opinion, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes I feel like people don't understand that, and I don't want to make it like woo-woo, but it's a calling to want to do this job. It's not just something you go and say, okay, I'm going to be an analyst or I'm going to do this. You really want to have to do it because it's not easy.
Right.
And so there has to be at least some sort of passion to give back to your community, to want to affect change or, be involved in justice or protect the innocent, be able to affect change for those who don't have a voice, children and victims, right?
100%. Yeah, and the passion has to be there, and I call that public service commitment.
Yeah.
You have to have a high degree of public service commitment, which means that, with all the barbs that we face, whether it's political, whether it's financial, budget cuts, whether it's social, where we've experienced the last almost 4 or 5 years of the anti-police sentiment. You have to be committed to be able to endure all of those things.
Yes.
And education alone isn't going to give you that commitment. You're going to have another why. And that why usually comes from within. It's a matter of what gets you up in the morning. What keeps you going after you get up, and what's going to bring you back the next day and the next day and the next day, because this is a career. 20, 30 years. And so people who sit in those rooms in Sacramento and fail to include us in those conversations won't have that perspective, and they won't understand, what we need in law enforcement officers to have the most professional police officer out there, to keep the streets as safe as they need to be. They're operating in this vacuum of trying to legislate for a singular problem. We had this incident, and we think this incident was horrible, so now we're going to do these things to stop that incident. And in this situation, going back to the George Floyd incident, which is the premise behind this legislation, they are focusing on a singular issue of race. And the flaw in that is that there were 2 white officers, 1 Asian officer, and 1 black officer at that incident. So this wasn't, all white guys on a non-white person.
Right.
This was, 2 people of color,
right,
essentially. And the issue had a lot of other dynamics. One officer was just barely off of training. Another officer had only been with the department for a year. So I could look at this as a manager, as a police manager, and I can see a lot of things that I would dig into. Training, supervision, what protocols were in place, all sorts of things, and then some of the things that we've already discovered, should be a part of it. Which is, maybe another officer who has a feeling that something's wrong should have a duty to intervene. Okay, we accepted that, and we've implemented that, but this is way beyond that. Now you're talking about, inhibiting our ability to effectively get people in the door, to start providing them the training that they need to do the job, and limiting our ability to now develop a culture of public service commitment. And I think that's where this whole premise is flawed. It's terribly flawed, and I can tell you now, even though it's being implemented. I've heard very little discussions on their plan for implementation. I've not heard.
They don't even have the curriculum written yet. They can't. How can you implement a?
I've seen some of the curriculum, or at least some of the proposed curriculums, and it's things like equity training and things that have nothing to do with developing, the skill set to prevent what, some see as the problem.
Yeah.
Because again, it's going back to the premise that the whole problem is because everyone's racist. And I just can tell you unequivocally after 34 years in the business that that's not our problem. That's not our biggest problem anyway. It's not to say that we don't have some flawed human beings in our industry. Of course we do.
Right.
But what I can tell you is that, this is not a systemic issue because it's not sanctioned, by organizations. It's an individual, and we usually fire them and we fine them, we discipline them, so when we're talking about making policies and when we're talking about implementing training programs, we have to train and create policy that's based on what we know our issues and our problems are, not the one-offs.
Right.
We eliminate the one-offs. We get rid of them. We don't create a whole policy for this guy or for this incident, and in some cases we do, but the bigger issue is that this is another unfunded mandate that is sure to cripple budgets, slow down our ability to, put officers on the streets, and this will inherently make communities less safe.
And that's, you touched on it before, but with recruitment and then retention being as difficult as it is, I mean, we're involved with negotiations right now. And so we're trying to tell the county, I don't know if you guys understand. Everybody's fishing from the same pool of people, especially post.
And we're hiring, by the way. I just want to put that up. Is this being recorded? Make sure
of course
make
it
sure
is.
That's out there.
Yes. You don't want to go work for the coolest police chief. No. But yeah, we're trying to explain that, especially post 2020, and especially, why would somebody want to come into this profession? It's hard enough as it is. It's hard enough when there's a level of respect, but then when there's all these things lauded at law enforcement, why would somebody, especially somebody who, I shouldn't even say especially, but why would somebody who has a college degree choose to go this route? Why would anybody choose to go this route unless there's an actual calling for it? And why would you put any impediment on those that want to do it by simply saying, we think that this one level of, formal check the box is what is going to qualify you to be a better officer or deputy? If
we look at, to your point about, recruitment and retention, if we look at what we've gone through the last, 4.5 years, this has put us behind in recruitment and retention for almost 10 years. And this is my estimate. I'm basing this on the fact that we created an environment where no one wanted to be a police officer anymore.
Right.
I mean, our traditional pool of recruitment had dried up, which is, has generally been the military.
Right.
Even military guys were like, hey, what? I've just done a tour. I've been fighting overseas. Why would I want to join the most unpopular industry in the world and be hated?
And I have my GI Bill, so I can go
do anything.
Yeah.
And so I think that sentiment, obviously grew across all dynamics. Whether it was a college graduate or whether it was just the guy from UPS that wanted to have a career change. It's very difficult to convince people to join the most hated team on the planet, and that's what we had become through these assaults that came from legislators, that came from activists, and that permeated the community. Even people who traditionally liked us became suspicious of us because of this constant barrage of false narratives and rhetoric. And so while we are climbing out of that, there's a lag in terms of recruitment.
Yes.
And the retention issue is one that's multi-dynamic as well. We have a lot of people who are retiring out, a lot of people who are choosing to take the early exit, and then we have a lot of people who even left the industry, and more specifically, they've left the state to get out of California.
Yes.
And so now the other swing that we see is almost agency to agency, because it's so competitive that if one agency is paying 50 cents more an hour, boom, you're going to lose that candidate, And so there's all those dynamics, oh, well, they have cooler uniforms, or they, do this or they do that. So it's so competitive.
Or they get a differential for working night shift, or they
get
a hiring bonus, right?
Exactly. So all of these things, the origins of it, go back to the politicization of policing, the demonization of policing, and the fact that you didn't have to, this all started with the defund the police movement. Well, there's no need to defund the police. All you had to do was demonize us enough to where no one wanted to join our ranks, and the same objective was achieved. We lost staffing. We don't have the numbers to field the optimal public safety, categories.
Right.
And so the effects of defunding are almost similar. And we were effectively villainized, making it such that it's impossible, or it was impossible for a long time to recruit. Changing slightly. Most agencies are seeing some improvements. I know that we have, but how we got here cannot be ignored, because we could easily go back to that.
Hopefully not. But
Hopefully
yes,
not.
but you're right.
Hopefully not.
Well, the way that
Well, and I don't say that to be pessimistic.
No, of course not.
I
It's
say
because
that
of politics, the
Because of
way
politics, absolutely. Because we're still in California,
Right.
And we still have a supermajority in Sacramento that is still hell bent on introducing legislation that's criminal friendly and cop villainizing.
Right.
So when we still have that dynamic, it doesn't matter if the governor all of a sudden has decided. Well, I probably shouldn't say all that.
No, you can. I already said it. I said it on.
Well,
we already slammed him, so don't worry about that.
So the governor has just had this newfound conservatism, and
Right.
he's on this campaign to try to reinvent himself as being law enforcement friendly, or even law enforcement interested, when he's had no interest in this for years. But his comrades haven't caught on. I would be happy if all of them made that turn, but no, it's just him right now. And so the supermajority is still out there, and they're still introducing bills that are not friendly to us. And so we have to be mindful of that, and we have to stay vigilant.
We've all been a little baffled at Newsom, right? But he doesn't want to be the governor of California anymore. Now he has to speak to the nation, which is largely more conservative than California. Right. And I would even argue, when you look at just your middle of the road Californians, we're not that different than the rest of the country. It's just that you have, one, the supermajority, but for whatever reason, you have this super progressive minority that controls that majority.
Right.
So even when you talk to moderate Democrats, you get this sense that they can't upset the powers that be. Oh. And that's the most frustrating part.
Very frustrating.
Is like, okay, you've seen your leader who has now shifted 180. Right. So to me, doesn't that say that just say what you think is right? Stop trying to appease the power or the leaders in your party, because they'll ditch you and your values, or these values that you feel.
I could almost put some names to that, but you're right. There are certain representatives, some of them local, that represent San Bernardino, that I have had conversations with, that I've known for years, that I've respected, that we've supported, we've endorsed, who have gone up to Sacramento and sold us out 100%. And, I've had conversations with one that, comes to mind, where she was very adamant about the need to go in the direction of her party. And I said, do you realize what this is doing to the streets of San Bernardino? And the issue at the time was a bill that they were introducing that was going to legalize loitering for the purposes of prostitution. Now,
in this community.
Yes.
That would, anywhere, but.
Yeah, if anyone's familiar with San Bernardino, there's a few areas that are hotbeds for prostitution, G Street, Baseline. And so I said to her, this has caused an explosion in the number of prostitutes that we're seeing on our streets. And, you've essentially legalized prostitution, because now you're making it, extremely difficult for us to go and solve a problem that is pretty obvious. When we see a woman that's out there wearing pasties and high heel shoes and standing on the street corner flagging down cars, right. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know what's going on there. But now, again, flawed legislation. The premise of this legislation was that we're oppressing minorities by addressing this issue. Yes, that again, written into the bill. And so, it's racist now to want a woman to not sell her body on the streets. But at the same time, these very politicians who authored that would stand and cheer for themselves while they opposed human trafficking. Right.
Oh, yeah, that's one of the check the boxes on their public safety, yes, right? When they say they support public safety, that's the first thing.
Human trafficking.
I voted for human.
So
these are the same thing.
exactly. So
And
the
you want to
virtue
legalize
signaling-
it here and you want to oppose it here.
Bingo. So the virtue signaling behind human trafficking would be something that they would applaud for themselves over.
Right.
But then when I, again, this particular representative, when I said, okay, so how can you say you are against human trafficking, but you'll impose a law that makes it impossible for me to investigate it?
Right.
If this woman is standing out there, the only way that I can know if she's out there on her own or being human trafficked
Right.
is to approach her, is to do the investigation. But you've now made it racist and against her civil rights, a violation of her civil rights for one of my officers to just go and make that approach. Now we have to go through a whole sting and I have to spend, hours and countless taxpayers' dollars to put, 6 officers out there, a cover officer, a decoy officer, all of that to get someone to offer her money. And then when she accepts the money, makes the deal, okay, now we can go over and arrest her. And this is a misdemeanor citation. Most agencies don't have the resources to do this all day for something that's that obvious. And so I bring that up because, again, a lot of them have sold us out. They are no longer interested or concerned with the things that directly affect public safety in their community. And they're only concerned or primarily concerned with staying connected to the party decisions. And that's horrible. But it's important for people to know that because people should be able to contact their local representatives and they should know what their local representatives are voting for or voting against that's in their public interest.
Well, and here's the thing, and not to defend any of these people, but I love my job. I want to keep it, right?
Yeah.
And so that's how you keep your job, especially when you're on 2-year terms in the Assembly and 4-year terms in the Senate. That is not a long time.
Right.
And when you have a supermajority, it makes it even worse because the party controls everything.
Yeah.
They control everything. So if you go against them, and I always bring this up, and you probably know her as well, Cheryl Brown, right?
Oh, no.
She was elected. Yeah. She went up there, great representative of this community, in my opinion, at least. Probably has more progressive, or I won't even say progressive, but maybe a little more liberal leaning views than I might have. But she was strong for this community. She went against the party for 2 votes that she felt strongly about for this region, that she said, I respect that you guys think this is great, but for my region, it's going to hurt my region.
Right.
She voted against him. They got her out. The party spent money against her to get her out.
And I know Miss Brown, and I respect her for that.
Me too.
But I think there's others who've abandoned that ideology.
Yeah.
And it's sad because our community deserves better. We need better. Again, there are certain things that directly impact San Bernardino in ways that other communities may not feel it or see it for some time. But here it's automatic, and some of that is because of the socioeconomics. We're a community that has a higher percent of poverty than some other communities, higher percentage of non-college graduates than some communities, and a clear dynamic of other crime elements, gangs, drugs, homelessness. So when you add all that together, it doesn't take much to spark a wave of something, whether it's a wave of prostitution because you've laxed legislation, or a wave of homelessness because you've changed or laxed legislation. So a lot of the things that they advocate for affect us greatly and quickly.
Yeah. It's funny, when you were going through that list, I was just thinking again kind of about the premise of the conversation. What makes a great police officer or a peace officer, right? Someone who has grown up in the community and wants to serve it. Someone who, understands crime and has probably been affected by it. Like, I don't think, well, maybe people do or don't understand, but a lot of people who become cops grew up in areas because they saw there was a difference that cops made. And they were like, I want to be part of the solution because I've lived with the problem. So then you take that and, you're talking about socioeconomics, you're talking about people who don't have access to the best education or, higher education, and yet they still have this calling to want to go be a law enforcement officer. Right. And then you have a bill that says, oh, I'm sorry, because you don't have a college degree.
Yeah. Isn't that horrible? I mean, it's horrible. And I'm hopeful that if it remains intact the way it is, that there will be some reconsiderations to how it's implemented, so that we can at least have a realistic opportunity to make it somewhat effective. Again, going back to my view, do I believe education is beneficial? Absolutely.
Yes.
I just don't believe it's a say-all, end-all to one's ability to do the job and do it effectively. So what that means to me is that, yes, we should continue to encourage, pursuit of higher education. But I don't think, I think two things should be considered. One is, I'm not convinced that it needs to be a professional law enforcement degree.
I agree.
I think that, our industry is so dynamic and so diverse in its application of the law that we don't need more law enforcement specific training.
Right.
What we need are the things that the rest of the world needs. We need officers who, can do coding. We need officers who, have degrees in communications. We need officers who have degrees in all various fields of law or technology or
HR, once you become a manager,
yes.
right? These are very specific areas that the rest of the corporate world has.
I'd hire an accountant right now. If there's an officer out there who has an accounting degree, so there's so many areas of education that could be beneficial to someone who chooses law enforcement as a career.
Yeah.
That they would be successful with that background, that we shouldn't limit it to a Sacramento designed, post-sanctioned professional law enforcement degree as a mandate.
Right.
Because what they're proposing to teach has nothing to do with what I need or want in my agency. I'll tell you that right now. And so I don't need someone coming in the door with a degree in ethnic studies. That's not going to help me. That's not going to help the citizens of the city of San Bernardino. What I need is someone who comes in with a professional degree in a variety of other things, but with a high public service commitment.
Yeah.
And that public service commitment means that you care about people. It means you care about your community. It means you care about doing the job and doing it the right way. And so I think that's one part. The other part is, in addition to not having it be a one-dimensional degree, if we could just agree that it shouldn't have to be possessed coming in the door.
Yes.
That there could be a measured way to allow the officer to attain it, maybe over the first 5 years.
Yes.
Something like that, where it's not painful to the officer, it's not painful to the organization, it's not something that we end up having to fund.
Right.
Because most municipal budgets, aren't going to be able to sustain, paying for college for every one that comes in the door. And I haven't heard anything from Sacramento about them funding it.
Right.
So if we could just say, hey, in the first 5 years, you should finish your degree.
So when I was
reasonable, that would be reasonable.
Yeah. And I truly believe
But what if they don't? So what?
Yeah,
what are we going to do?
You're going to fire them?
Yeah, and so these are the things.
Decertify them, or
yes.
Who knows? Don't get any idea, Sacramento. We're not proposing that.
We just don't know.
Right,
with
right.
this supermajority, what that would mean, and so that's where myself and other chiefs have concerns, is because there's so many unanswered questions. There's so many things that they haven't even allowed us to question, but yet it keeps coming up and it keeps getting pushed through, and now it's at this point, where we thought something had died, it comes back, and now it's being implemented.
When we were at the table, and I truly only believe it's because we have a phenomenal lobbyist, and unfortunately that's what it takes in Sacramento, is to get to the table. And even then it was just so they could say, okay, we talked to SEBA, and
right.
Go shoo now. We'll do what we want, And
they'll add you to the list of law enforcement supporters.
No, but yeah. So that was kind of our premise was, hey, we're all for education, but it should be a benefit, not a barrier.
Right.
So if you don't mandate it, coming in, because then it doesn't affect recruitment, then you say, hey, we're the state of California. We have, do we have great educational institutions in the state? Probably the best in the nation, if not the world. Why don't we then, so you have X amount, and guess what? You get free tuition to Cal States or UCs, or
kind of like they do with the military.
Yes.
With the GI Bill.
Yes.
Yeah,
and then you have X amount of time to finish it. That should be a benefit.
Right.
And if that's something that you want to enhance the profession.
Can you imagine how that would improve recruitment?
Oh my gosh.
I mean, I could see that being wonderful, but I don't think that was a part of any of their discussions.
Oh, no. I brought it up. And like I said, it was like, you're cute, go away or whatever. Like, okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I see it so much more too, because like, I have my oldest son went to college. He's an academic, right? My youngest son, he's planning to go to college. Who knows? He's only 15. Yeah. But my daughter, she's not a college person. And I have to respect that. Right. She wants to go to the military. She wants to work with her hands. Yeah. And so that's how her dad was. But I will say this, when her dad was in his 30s or later, coming out of high school, he had no interest in doing more school. None. He went to the military. He came to law enforcement. Phenomenal, law enforcement officer. Just great. Street smarts, all of it. And then thought, I would like to get my degree because I'm older now. I'm more mature. I know that I can write these amazing reports and do all this stuff. I don't think it's as hard as I thought it was when I was 18, right? That would be amazing to offer it as a benefit.
Right.
And
I will tell you, not to go down the rabbit hole, but what you just described is one of the reasons that I don't always encourage people to go get a degree right away. When I sit and do an interview with someone, whether it's a hiring interview or some sort of advancement interview, often what do I need to do to get to the next level? That's the question. What do I need to do to get promoted? And you've been around long enough where you'll see work performance evaluations that'll say, continue your education, just sort of the rubber stamp.
Right.
Well, one of the things that I learned in my own sort of disjointed pursuit of education is that whatever degree you get today at, coming in the door at 21 will very unlikely be something that is needed in the industry 15 years from now. When you're at that, entering that executive level stage of your career, because things are changing so much.
True.
And that's not to say that all degrees, will have an expiration like that, but there's a lot of things that may be in now, that may be, popular now, but they could be phased out through some sort of technological advancement. Look at how many things are going to change because of the implementation of AI.
Right.
Look at how much has changed because of the advancement in, our technology overall. So, I say that to emphasize a point. And the point is that, folks should be allowed to get into their career, learn the art of policing, pursue the myriad of training that we will provide them.
And mandate them.
And mandate. There's so much that they will get in terms of how to be a cop. We will train you how to be a cop. There will be tons of classes on how to be a great cop. So they will get educated and educated beyond necessity in some cases. Right. But then give them a chance to develop a sense of maturity, develop a sense of purpose, and then they can decide what exactly they want to do with their education and why.
Yeah.
Because that's the key, for them to be successful at it anyway, is to have a solid why. Why are you going to do it? Why are you going back to school? What's the purpose? What will you do with that information and that degree? So sometimes people need time. And if Post is saying, just get something now, or Sacramento saying, just get something now, or you won't be able to get a job, it's going to be a mess.
Well, and if they would listen, I would argue, and again, I left the department as a detective, so it's not like I made any executive level over at the department, but I am in an executive level here.
Right.
And from observing, I would argue that the more formal education comes at the higher ranks. Right. Managing multi-million, if not $1 billion budget, managing people, human resources, knowing what to do legally with complaints about hostile work environments or sexual harassment. Right. Those are specific skill sets that people actually major in college, right? Yes. And there's actual VPs of corporations that's all they oversee. That's all they do, right? Lots of things, like you said, accounting, tech, right?
Yes.
All of these things would be things that can be great at all levels, but I think they're especially needed in the higher levels when you're really,
absolutely,
getting into the organizational
because
leadership.
Now you're essentially, my executive team they're essentially like the CEOs of this company called San Bernardino Police Department.
Right.
And, we are a subsidiary of the city of San Bernardino, so we have an obligation, a fiduciary obligation, an operational obligation to the city as a whole, to its residents. And so we have to know what we're doing. We can't learn it as we go. We can't, guess. We have to know what we're doing because it's a high stakes game. And as much as, I'm still learning every day,
right.
It's usually something that experience, helps you perform better at. And I think, experience combined with formal education is the key.
Right.
However, when you're at the entry level, I think you need more experience first.
Yes.
And then you can hone in on exactly what education you will need to enhance those experiences.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Of course. So when I got hired by the sheriff's department, I had a degree in print journalism with a minor in public policy and management from USC. I mean, I don't even think I was able, for my own self, I could put my degree to use in terms of being a good writer, a good communicator, a good interviewer, all of those things. But for the department's benefit, outside of just my individual work product, that didn't come into play till 6 years on when I went to public affairs, right?
Right.
Or now here at SEBA, having that background. So, yeah. And then I think of all the times I've learned so much from my colleagues from the military, right?
Right.
And that's not to say
and that was
they're
mostly their life experience that trained you.
Exactly. So, and I don't think I was less of a cop. We just had different skill sets. And that's what made us so strong as a station, as a team, right? Like, okay, I know you've got my back in this, or you can help me. Hey, the way you lined up for that search warrant, let me show you a little something. Okay, perfect. Hey, can you help me with my report writing? Can you help me with this press release I have to do? Absolutely, And so that's what makes the rounding out of the profession is what's so important.
Absolutely. And what I'm hearing you say is that, there's a variety of types of education.
Yes.
And they don't all have to be formal.
Yes.
It doesn't all have to come from college. A lot of it can come from life experience. A lot of it can come from, different career paths. That person from the military learned something that would be different than a person who, worked, at a news firm,
Right.
But, now that they're both in law enforcement, they can bring, those experiences, to this profession and be wonderfully successful.
Yeah.
Wonderfully successful. And neither of them have to necessarily have a college degree from the start.
No.
So I think, and again, going back, just to be clear, if a person has one, that's great. That's great. My concern or opposition is just making it a mandate.
Exactly.
I think that we have to understand that a mandate to have a degree coming in the door is one that would just be detrimental for our industry. It would be, operationally unsustainable. And I think that we would end up having some gaps in public service by that mandate.
And I will say this, because of the shift in college prep and all that stuff, which I could debate, which would be a whole nother podcast,
Right.
especially now having a daughter that but I digress. We are seeing incoming deputies or officers. There is a much higher educational level anyways.
Yes, there is.
But you're right. Why stop somebody who doesn't have that? Why prohibit somebody?
Correct.
And then I'll also say this. There's not a college degree in the world that is going to prepare you for a drowning child or walking into a home where there's cockroaches literally falling off the ceiling into your hair.
Yeah, or from getting socked in the face when you've never been socked in the face before.
There's that too.
So I want, again, this is for San Bernardino PD, for all those who are looking for a job. I want cops who have a high degree of public service commitment.
Yeah.
People who are ready to do the job, willing to do the job, and understand what the job entails. You can have a degree, and that's great.
Yeah.
But where's your heart?
Right.
Where's your grit? What's your, my own word, what's your stick-to-itiveness? How willing are you to stick to it when it's tough? when it's hard, when you get told no, when you get spit on. This is what makes a good cop.
Yeah.
And so the degree, folds like a cheap tent if you don't have all those other factors that are innate. And I think that I'd take a degreeless candidate with heart and grit over someone who can tell me, how many degrees they have.
Right. And that's not to say that they can coexist, right? You can
absolutely.
I think of the cultural education. If you don't grow up in a socioeconomically disadvantaged area or you haven't been around gangs or stuff like that, you can see the cultural awakening, right? Because they've never seen that before, right? So
I see those looks often.
Right. Yeah. San Bernardino. I mean, I think, gosh, one time when I was still at headquarters, I had to take one of my kids to the office, or they didn't have school. Something happened. And they were like, where are we? Right. And that's your city.
In the Dino.
Which you've done amazing. I mean, the stats speak for themselves, but I think the morale and how proud everybody is to work for you.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate that. But what I say all the time is, I don't do the work. I have a phenomenal team that does.
Yeah.
And I have great people. And again, people who have a high level of public service commitment, and they're about it. They every single day. What I say often is every day in San Bernardino is game day, and we play to win. And so we don't lose. We don't believe in losing. You can't lose. And so I think that mindset has permeated through the organization, and that's the results that you're seeing. Is we're winning.
And going back to that kind of wide-eyed look at the culture shock, I think there's also something to be said for the person that didn't grow up that way, has never seen it, and says, I'm going to stick to it, right? I'm here for this.
Right.
I'm not leaving.
Right.
This is the community I'm sworn to protect.
Exactly.
Right.
And you touched on something earlier, about the commitment of people who have an investment. Those who did grow up there. And I have several stories, and it warms my heart because I have some that are on my executive team that grew up in San Bernardino. That lived in the park. That went through trials and tribulations with their family, where the police department were regular visitors to their homes, and against all the odds, now they're San Bernardino police officers. Against all the odds, now they're part of my executive team. So when you look at that, and you look at how people can transcend the difficulties, they can transcend the problems and the challenges of a tough city like San Bernardino, and do it without a degree, and become wildly successful in the organization and become leaders of the organization. That again speaks to the diversity that we have, where yes, degrees are nice, but degrees aren't everything, because look, look at the examples that I have, and look at the performance that I'm getting, from these individuals who didn't have one, and now I'm encouraging them to go back and get them.
Yeah.
But, I would just, and I'm bringing this up because I can't help but shudder to think, if there was a mandate that required me to tell these individuals no, and the loss that the organization and the community would suffer if I had missed out on some of these candidates. Because, I'm sorry, you don't have your degree,
Not only the loss that the community and the city would suffer, what about that person?
Yeah.
Right? Somebody
absolutely.
Sitting in your executive staff, or even, that's a phenomenal living. That's a great, those are benefits. That's retirement.
Right.
That's a really great way. That door gets shut on them. Yeah. If we go back to, these lofty virtue signaling goals.
Right.
What are you saying?
Exactly.
Right? Like, you're closing doors to career opportunities by putting a mandate in place.
And taking, it's not just for the individual, we're talking about, families, generations, all the people who are now not, burdening the system because, now their primary financial provider has a good job where these people are taken care of, and we continue that success. So again, I have no qualms with someone who has a degree or who wants to pursue a degree, and I encourage it on every level. I'm just more interested in knowing what the plan is, for implementation of this bill that's being proposed,
Yeah.
from a true operational sense. And that's not been clarified to me, and I happen to be the president of the San Bernardino County Chiefs and Sheriffs Association, and so we go to Sacramento often.
Yeah.
And we have lobbyists, and we do our own lobbying.
Right.
But we have legislative liaisons. Phenomenal one that works for the Sheriff's Department, Dylan Levinsky, who's in Sacramento all the time, and he's constantly giving us information about bills that are on deck.
Yeah.
Those that are threatening, to our industry and to our communities. And there's just not been enough clarity on how this bill is to be implemented, and I'm concerned with what I've heard so far and what I know right now, that if it were to be mandated in its current form, we'd have some problems.
So I even read, in the haste to get this signed and to add it to the political, resume of whoever they want to put their stamp on reforming police.
Reggie Jones Sawyer.
Yes. Okay. Of course, a lot of details were missed, which we've discussed at length. But one very key one was whether Post even has this authority to do this. And so they're talking about having to take it back to amend it anyways.
Well, that's a good thing, because maybe,
I agree.
Maybe they can make other amendments while they're at it.
Maybe we can revamp it or kill it.
But that illustrates how ill-conceived many of these bills are, because they start in a vacuum with a flawed premise. The premise is, okay, we need to teach them how not to be racist.
Yeah.
So we need to have a degree for that. So they started with a flawed premise, and now they're trying to fill it in as they go, and they end up here where now they're having to take it back because there's things missing, or there's things that just clearly won't work. And that's a horrible way to learn that the people elected to run your state do business.
That's how they legislate, though. You look at some of these bills. My kids have written, essays in school longer than a law, right? And I don't even mean like an essay, like a 2-page,
Right.
They're so short.
Yeah.
There's very little analysis done. The legislative cycle is 8 months long.
Yes.
I've seen city projects, right? Back when I was a reporter, I've seen planning commissions spend more time analyzing environmental impact reports and all of these studies. How's it going to affect this? How's it going to affect that? And that's for a development. This is a law. You're implementing a law. It's crazy.
So not to be cynical, but I think that it deserves to be said. What are the requirements to be a legislator?
Maybe they should have a college degree.
Is there a degree requirement to be a legislator? I mean, you're making the law,
Yeah.
For the state of California. You're making a law that affects, millions of people throughout our state, that affects economies, that affects,
California, the fifth
social,
largest economy in the world,
social
right?
standing. So how much education do they have to have? Just a question. And I think if we look at just common sense like that, then some of these discussions could be a little different, and maybe they would just listen to us and include us at the table, but they don't, and that's where it's very clear that these things aren't for the benefit of law enforcement. They're not for the benefit of the community. This is about a party ideology, and in many cases, this one particularly, it's about punishing police, not making police better. And that's what, it comes down to in too many cases. A lot of the things that were knee-jerk reactions through the social justice movement were not about making police better. It was about punishing police.
Yeah.
And I hope that we can move away from that faster than we're doing. But until we get back to just some common sense understanding that, look, police are a necessary tool, a necessary part of our community.
Yes.
We're an integral part of our community because we all come from the community.
Yes.
They don't hire police from some special planet. They're from the same neighborhood that you're from. They go to the same school, church that you go to. We're just people. We're just folks, right?
Yeah.
So with that, our profession is one that requires a different level of commitment. And yes, in some cases, it may require some special education and some special training. But we can't let people who have no interest in understanding what we do, no interest in learning what we do, no interest in listening to us tell them what we do and how we could do it better, continue to make these laws in a vacuum without being challenged. And that's where I think more people need to get involved. I think more people need to write letters, understand and know who your representatives are, know their phone number, know their email, because we have to have people get involved in some of these processes to at least make them pump the brakes a little bit.
Yeah.
Because there's too many things that are happening. There's too many things that are coming down the pike that are detrimental. I was just reading yesterday, there's a new bill that's being introduced to go against the Supreme Court decision of Grants Pass and re-implement provisions that would limit law enforcement from being able to enforce the anti-camping bans. And specifically, the language says that you can still remove encampments, but we would be prohibited from being able to do any law enforcement related to the violations that stem from encampment. So trespassing, littering, blocking sidewalks, all the things that are violations, public safety issues, municipal code issues. This bill would prevent us from being able to enforce any of that.
So removing consequences.
Again. Yes, again.
Which, yeah. I mean, it's like, do they not?
And I know that's a little off topic of education.
No,
but,
yeah.
But it's part and parcel to the fact that, these legislators, are often operating in a vacuum, and they're not operating in the best interests of our community at large. These are party-driven decisions that are not considering what's in the best interests of all of us.
Well, and it goes back to your point about people getting more involved, because up and down the state, homelessness was one of the top polling issues, and homelessness is directly connected to how people see public safety, right?
Right, yeah.
Because let's be honest, the most egregious crimes usually happen in in areas where it's just highly, why can't I speak today? But
populated,
highly
density,
populated area, or
yeah,
it's within a certain area, right? But the majority of people, they don't see murders every day, or what they see is they're driving their kid to school, and it used to be a beautiful, park, and now they see homeless people.
Correct.
So they equate that with being safe. And I don't. Every poll this last election showed that here in the state of California. And I don't. So where are these leaders coming? Like, are they not listening?
So relevant to discussions that I have every day in my city. We unfortunately have the highest number of homeless in the county, in the city of San Bernardino, as confirmed by our point in time count, our annual point in time count. And obviously, it's not something I'm proud of, but it's a fact. And to your point, when we ignore the crimes that are associated with this population, that's unfair to the rest of our constituents. It's unfair, to those kids that want to have a safe park to play in. And, through the Grants Pass decision, it was just finally saying, hey, look, you can enforce your laws. You can enforce your laws,
right?
And just because they're homeless, isn't that great? We can go back to enforcing laws. But now, there's a new spin that's being proposed to now take that away from us again. So, again,
what?
Don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But I really think it's important to note that we have, with this proposed education requirement, there's a lot of requirements that are being, pushed out of Sacramento, unfunded mandates, things that are detrimental to public safety, things that are anti-community, things that are anti, safety. So folks have to pay attention before it hits their doorstep, because once it's signed and sealed and it's law, then law enforcement has to do what? Follow the law.
Right.
And so, what myself, and I know Sheriff Dyke is, great friend, wonderful, proponent of all the same things.
Yeah.
We are often trying to speak out and educate people and inform people about these things, because once it's happening, their perception is the cops aren't doing anything.
Right.
The sheriff's not doing anything. When the reality is that we can't, because the law now has taken our tools away.
Yep.
And so, again, not to hijack the podcast talking about other stuff, but I really think it's important for people to know and to hear.
Yeah, and we're in the thick of it right now in legislative season after the break,
yes,
and I'm sure I'll see you up there.
Oh, you'll see me up there.
Yeah. Man, it's been great. I could talk to you forever.
Yeah.
So, and maybe after this legislative session, we'll have another podcast where
I'll come back.
We'll have you back. But man, it's been great to have you. And
well, I appreciate being here. It's been wonderful, and I'm sorry it took so long. I appreciate the invite.
I'm glad. Yeah. You're great for the profession. You're great for morale. You're, like you said, your relationship with the sheriff. It's really good to see. So we appreciate you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Appreciate it.